Deep underground, secure behind heavy steel doors, a master counterfeiter operates a massive printing press. The room smells of fresh ink. They are frantically printing millions of dollars in flawless bills. The artistry is perfect. They are, by all internal metrics, a billionaire. But eventually, the physical body requires sustenance. They step out of the basement, walk into the harsh daylight of a local market, and attempt to buy a simple loaf of bread. The cashier takes one look at the bespoke currency and rejects it. The tragedy crystallizes instantly. The counterfeiter is a billionaire in the dark, but entirely bankrupt in the daylight. This is not a criminal enterprise. It is a psychological quarantine. The human brain requires social input and safety just as a biological entity requires oxygen. When starved of that deep, stabilizing connection, the mind refuses to accept the void. Instead, it builds a mint. We are currently observing a severe emotional famine. Loneliness, burnout, and acute financial stress have caused severe emotional deflation. The brain, facing this deficit, manufactures a synthetic substitute, which is, frankly, a highly inventive way to survive a Tuesday, even if it leaves the laundry sitting in the basket. A mint requires massive industrial energy to function. The physical actions associated with this condition, the relentless pacing, the quiet whispering to invisible companions, the repetitive hand gestures, these are not random ticks. They are the kinetic gears of the printing press turning. The afternoon light is shifting across a small rug. Someone is pacing its length, back and forth. Their expression is frozen, eyes locked on a fixed point that isn't really there. They have been walking for 2 hours. Their calves ache. They let a phone call ring out. The individual is burning catastrophic amounts of caloric and temporal energy to keep the counterfeit economy afloat. They are literally walking miles inside a 10-foot room. When individuals carrying this exhaustion finally seek clinical help, traditional medicine acts as an auditor looking for the wrong crime. Because this condition lacks official diagnostic recognition, the overlapping symptoms, specifically the inability to focus on real-world tasks, are almost universally flagged as standard ADHD. Research in this area tends to suggest a massive overlap, often cited around 70%, with that specific deficit. Traditional medicine sees a glitch in attention. It misses the underlying emotional paralysis completely. A patient sits in a brightly lit clinic. Their eyes are tracking the doctor's clipboard, but their hands are tense because they are fighting a war in a world that doesn't exist. The auditor diagnoses a focus deficit and prescribes stimulants. But prescribing stimulants to an underground counterfeiter doesn't fix the emotional insolvency. It just makes the printing press run faster. The medication treats the symptom of distraction while missing the root cause, an absolute famine of genuine human connection. The individual is caught in a hostile neurological takeover. The daydream is no longer a temporary relief. It is an active override of the central nervous system. The brain has recognized that generating synthetic dopamine is more efficient than extracting it from a barren social landscape, so it establishes a permanent quarantine. There is research regarding dopamine and attention that points at something crucial here. What psychology has noticed is that when the reward centers are hijacked by hyperstimulating internal narratives, external reality simply cannot compete for focus, which might explain a specific thing, not the distraction itself, the biological exhaustion underneath it. Funding a reality no one else can see is draining. Processing an imagined world while navigating the physical gravity of this one requires an immense caloric draw. It is the direct biological consequence of running heavy industrial machinery inside a fragile biological frame. They build empires of adoration, orchestrating perfect conversations where they are finally understood. But the rent is still due. Jobs are lost, relationships decay, the physical body atrophies from neglect. The isolation deepens. You didn't choose this, but you're the only one in a position to notice it. That's not burden. That's actually the only real place this changes. What psychology has noticed is that printing infinite fake money tends to produce emotional hyperinflation, because the mental fantasies are entirely controllable and instantly gratifying. The brain's standard for emotional reward skyrockets. The tragedy is that real human connection is messy. It is awkward. It is painfully low dopamine. Someone stutters, they say the wrong thing. They do not look at you the way your invented companion does. The counterfeit economy requires no patience. It delivers a flawless return on investment every single time. The brain naturally begins to reject the low-yield, high-effort interactions of the physical world. They are at a dinner with a friend. The friend is talking about their day. It is a perfectly fine conversation, filled with normal human pauses and slight hesitations. But the brain is starved for the high-yield dopamine of the basement mint. The real world is moving too slowly. They nod, excuse themselves to the restroom, lock the door, and stare at the mirror just to get a hit of the fantasy. This is where the hyperinflation strikes the core identity. They have told themselves they just prefer their own company, that they are naturally solitary. But that is a story used to cover up a much harder truth. They haven't lost the need for people. They have just hyperinflated their internal currency so much that they can no longer afford the low dopamine cost of being known by a real human being. The fantasy world actively devalued their reality. This realization usually hits on an ordinary evening, usually while standing in the kitchen, the static of the refrigerator humming in the background. The brain chooses this exact synthetic reality because it guarantees a zero-risk return on investment. The counterfeit economy has no market crashes. The characters never leave, never change their minds, and never inflict unexpected pain. The safety is absolute. The mind creates a perfectly closed feedback loop of anesthesia, protecting the individual from the gravity of real-world rejection. You cannot survive on fiat fantasy. The physical body will eventually demand payment. The pattern was built by circumstances. It's maintained by habit. Habits can be examined when you're ready to look at them. Healing requires something incredibly difficult, deliberately shutting down the press. We call this currency deflation. It starts with physical anchoring, forcing the mind to accept the low-denomination coins of sensory reality, feeling the cold tile underfoot, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. It means braving the initial poverty of the real world. For most people I've observed carrying this, the initial withdrawal is severe because the silence of reality feels deafening compared to the roar of the printing press. The mind will panic. It will attempt to hijack your attention, begging you to turn the heavy machinery back on. It will feel like starvation. But it is not starvation. It is the painful, necessary process of learning how to breathe actual oxygen again instead of relying on a synthetic substitute. If you have been running this press in the dark, which I suspect many of you are, you probably aren't going to tell anyone you watched this. That is fine. But if something here landed, try to sit in the quiet of your actual room for 1 minute longer than feels comfortable. That is the entire ask. You will probably slip back into the basement tomorrow. Not because you don't understand the inflation, but because understanding an economy and surviving it are two entirely different things. There is no secret door out of the basement. There are only the stairs, and a real, awkward penny buys infinitely more actual life than a billion counterfeit dollars.